You know, when you sit down with people and your initial assumption is my way is right and your way is wrong, and I'm here to convince you to my way, there's not a lot of hope in that approach.
I'm Ellen Shepard. I'm usually behind the camera as a director.
Okay.
Ellen, thank you. And Jessica, so give it about, after he says that they're going, then give it about 20 seconds.
We're ready?
Rolling.
Audio's rolling. Okay, anytime, Ellen.
ויוציאני אדוני ממצרים ביד חזקה ובזרוע נטויה ומבורא גדול באותות ומופתים.
These are the gifts of God. We are the people of God. Take them in remembrance that Jesus Christ died. Feed on him in your hearts by faith with thanksgiving.
Through him, with him, in the unity of the Holy Spirit, all glory and honor is yours, Almighty Father, forever and ever.
And do you promise to provide for them the kind of Christian home in which they'll see the presence of Christ lived out in your lives, so that the day will one day come when they too will confess their faith in Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord? And do you, congregation, receive Jake and Mary Claire into our family of faith? He's not sure he accepts me, but...
Everything we do is to forgive. We realize for every forgiveness is wisdom of Allah. When we forgive somebody, we don't do his riba, we don't envy him, we are not jealous of him, we don't think bad about him. It all begins forgiveness. No matter what somebody does, just forgive.
I invited a group of very distinguished religious leaders from different denominations to share a meal with me, to have a conversation without any agenda, to really speak the truth. If all the religions here believe in one God, what is the need for different religions? Why not just one religion? Because we all believe in the one God.
And it's a tradition of Muslims that you start with a prayer. So if you permit me, we'll do that, then
Sure,
start the day. And it says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitani rajim. We ask the protection from the Satan first. Then we say, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I start in the name of God, the most merciful, the most beneficent. It's the same religion. I think it's only one religion.
Yes.
I think we are all come to what we call the Abrahamic religion. It starts from Abraham and it comes down. And then came all the other prophets came, and then came Moses, and then came Jesus, peace be upon all of them. And that's what they needed. And we believe that Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the last messenger who brought every religion together, kind of saying what was said before, and he was the last messenger. So we don't treat that they are different religion. We think there's the same religion, which is the religion of Islam. Islam only means submission. And so Abraham submitted, Jesus submitted, Moses submitted, and Muhammad submitted. So to us, it's the same religion coming from the same source of one God.
You know, anybody who is a teacher or a preacher knows that you've got to find many different ways to reach many different students or different people. I suspect, though I don't have proof of this, that God figured out a long time ago that God could reach different people in different cultures in a variety of ways. That may explain why there is such variety, because there are varieties of people. And that variety gives birth to even new variety. At its best, it is a beautiful thing. At its worst, it can be a horrible thing.
And I've had some confusion, just being Jewish myself, whether or not Jewish people, because I'm not even sure if we're supposed to believe in Satan or the devil. Where are we with that?
For the most part, Judaism believes that everyone is born with the inclination to do good and the inclination to do evil, that the devil isn't some separate outside being forcing us in one way or another, but we have that freedom to choose, and that's the beauty of humanity, is that we do have the ability and the freedom to choose between good and evil. And the devil isn't something outside, but it is what we become if we continually choose evil.
And is that based on original sin?
Well, it's actually the antonym to original sin, because original sin says that you're sinful from the beginning. And Judaism teaches that you're neutral, you're neither good nor bad. Your actions are good or evil depending on your choices. And one good action doesn't make you a good person, nor does a bad action make you a devil.
When you open the New Testament, the idea of the devil, Satan, is a very clear concept. And it seems to me that it was a development over time where people saw the mystery of human sin and asked themselves the question, what is the answer to this? Why are people, or why are some people so prone to turning toward evil? What's the answer to that? Even the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, asked the question, there are things that I wish to do that I don't do. There are things that I determine I'm not going to do those things, and I end up doing those things. And he said, what's happening here, it's not just me, but there's some other force, as it were, that draws me in. And I think we see that even in our own day and age.
So do you think, therefore, that man doesn't necessarily have free will? That when it comes to evil, that there may be an evil force behind?
No, I'm very big on free will. I think we have free will. But I think we live in a world that there's more going on than meets the eye. But I do know that sometimes we find ourselves wrestling against things that we're not really aware of that draw us in. And I think that is the mystery of sin. All of us know that there are things in this world that I know this is what I need to do. Even if it's just a matter of what we eat, I know I ought to eat this kind of food and so forth. But how often do we find ourselves doing the very thing that we have said we would not do?
Jessica made these herself.
Speaking of sin. And one of the things I'm very aware of, without getting spooky, is that if you look on the level of a group, on the social level, there are times, Reinhold Niebuhr wrote that book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, that how is it possible for otherwise good and decent people to get in a collective and suddenly be capable of incredible evil? Mm-hmm. They're perfectly good people, and yet you put them in a group, and there's like a spirit takes over that group. And we've seen that throughout history. I think one of the insights about the devil, or even in the New Testament talks about powers and principalities, is that institutional arrangements, political arrangements, governments, churches, religious institutions, collectives have the capacity to consume an individual and lead them down a path that they might not otherwise go. And when that's evil, something else is in play. And I'm not saying it's a spook, but I think the insight about the devil is pointing to that as well.
So when you're talking about groups, could you point to perhaps Hitler and the Nazi movement, and that's such a strong, powerful
group? We're
sitting
here in the American South where slavery once existed.
Right.
How is it possible for good Christian people who went to church every Sunday?
Exactly.
You stop and think about that. How did that happen? Right. These people did go to church. Many of them did say their prayers.
And we still have KKK here in the South.
Yeah.
There was real crisis, a theological crisis that took place during the Civil War, because the moral voices were not united, and they were using the same tools, if you will, of the Scripture to promote their particular perspective, whether it was slavery, or we could look at that with today's issues as well.
So as we have a little nosh, do participate. Call it a non-diet day if you don't mind.
Okay.
You know, a little sin. Couldn't hurt, I don't think. I don't know. It's not for me to say.
Yeah.
But if we could go back to what we just started in the other room, is thinking about heaven. We're talking about being good to God and living for God or through God or after we die. So many people, I think, right now, because the world seems very unsteady. It's even though media is making us one very close, at the same time, it's scaring us to death because you feel so helpless. People are feeling so helpless because one tragedy after another tragedy after another tragedy. And then people want something, I feel, to hold on to, that they can feel safe for their families, their loved ones, themselves. And they want to know, recently, for instance, 2 years ago, my mother passed away. And I hold her, of course, very close to my heart. And I still don't really have the realization that she's not with me anymore. And I don't know that I believe personally in a heaven, but yet I don't know what to believe, actually. So if I could throw this out to you and say, what do you believe in? What do you think? Is there some place we ascend to? What happens after we die?
I think that it was beautiful the way you described your mother, and you don't believe that she's really not with you, that part of you can't believe that, right, because there's a connectivity between your soul and her soul.
Definitely.
And the remembrance brings her literally, not just figuratively, but literally brings her within you, and you feel that spirit. And there are moments when a scent or a food that you might see brings her right before you. And Martin Buber talks about I and thou, that our moments of connection are those moments when our souls touch one another. And as soon as we name it, it becomes an it. It's not there anymore at all. But the connectivity of soul to soul doesn't end when you lose a loved one. And you build upon those moments in your partnership with God during your life, and then they continue throughout. As you've planted seeds all over the earth, there are people who are connecting to your soul. And in that ethereal sense, for me, that's a sense of what heaven might be. It's those connections that connect our soul to one another and to God.
So then, is heaven on earth?
Heaven is on earth, and heaven is beyond earth, because those souls that you're connecting to, your mother you're connecting to, isn't literally living here on earth.
Right.
But the essence of her soul is here, on earth, right, or in the universe. Her soul isn't gone. The soul stuff of the universe remains with us.
But then again, through the Christian beliefs, how do you feel about whether or not there is a literal heaven?
I mean, is it going to be a house with many rooms like this beautiful home that we're in here? I don't know. I mean, the scriptures give us some insight. Both the Hebrew scriptures, the Christian tradition talks about a house with many rooms, of many mansions. So I think there are some insights. I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think theology does its best to try to articulate what that might be. But I mean, I don't know that I don't know that any of us are going to be able to give you a sketch and said this is what it. So
this
you
is what
recognize
heaven looks
it.
like.
Yeah. It's like Lucy said about love. I mean, or the souls. Once you name it, it's gone.
It becomes an it, and not a relationship anymore.
Would that be kind of a visual poem?
Yeah, that's a good way to. Yeah, it is. Yep.
And that's how I think it really is poetry, which is none of us would say, well, it's just a poem. It's not true. Well, it is true, but it points beyond something that we can name specifically. And I think that's why it's interesting in the Scriptures that there are different metaphors for heaven. We've mentioned in my Father's house are many rooms, Jesus said, but John in the book of Revelation sees New Jerusalem coming down, a beautiful city, more beautiful than anything you can ever imagine. Its dimensions are greater than anything you can imagine, and 12 gates, which suggests there's room for everyone. And then, of course, Jesus said from the cross, today you will be with me in paradise, which is a word that refers to a garden. The Apostle Paul talks about resurrection. All of these are images of a world beyond, and they help us to get glimpses of what it means.
Yeah. The best we do is point to it, and we are pointing to something. But our language breaks down, so that even to say literally, I mean, our language is made for tables and countertops. But as soon as you move beyond the realm of talking about something very tangible and physical, and even talking about love, you're going to have to say a poem.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to have to paint a picture. And when you move beyond to higher levels of reality or deeper levels of reality, which is what we're talking about when we talk about the realm of God, which is what you're talking about when you point about heaven, we don't have language to really get at that. The best we can do is point to it. God's not finished with us yet at the grave. The God who created this world and all its beauty and all its complexity has more to show us. And he's not finished with us when we breathe our last.
I wonder if one way to kind of get some insight is to look at our different funeral rituals, of how we ritualize funerals, or when the person has gone, because as you were talking, words can't bear love. I mean, and the funeral ritual is meant to express what words can't express. I mean, that, at least in the Catholic tradition, I mean, all the symbols that we use to try to somehow grasp the grief, if you will, the loss. I mean, how do we name that? How do we move through that, allow it to move through our being?
And what are some of those? Because being Jewish, I'm not familiar with the symbols that you use in Catholicism, for instance.
When we begin the funeral mass, we begin at the entrance of the church, which signifies the entrance of not only the Christian community and that church, but also symbolizing the entrance of our loved one entering into God's kingdom. And we sprinkle the casket with holy water, calling to mind baptism, which is a way of entering into the community. And then we cover it with a white funeral pall, symbolizing it's a new creation. This loved one is now a new creation with God. At my dad's funeral, who passed a few years ago, we had his baptismal garment, which I and his sister and cousins, so it was we were all baptized in that, and it was a touching symbol of the beginning of the Christian journey and the end of the Christian journey. So placed on his casket. And there's a candle which represents the light of Christ, a large Paschal candle. And then that's there as well. And then there's a sense of incensing, where we, as the psalmist says, let my prayer rise before you like incense. I mean, we can't actually see physically, and it goes back to kind of once you name the it, we can't see the soul rising, but we use the incense as a way of allowing our prayers to rise and offering this person who's been a great gift in our lives, great gift, offering that gift back to God and giving thanks to God, and that our worship might give praise to God for the ways in which we've seen the face of Christ through the life of this person.
In terms of the Jewish burial rites and Muslim burial rites are very similar in terms of the community has a responsibility for cleansing the body. Many of the funeral homes actually locally here now have a room they call the Tahara room. Tahara means cleansing, right? And we have community members who volunteer to come and to wash the body.
And aren't they called something, the people that do that?
The Hevra Kadisha is the name. It means the holy community.
We have the same thing. We have people who know how to do that, so we call them. They come and wash the body.
Right, and there's some communities in the United States where Muslims and Jews have come together to create their own, not a funeral home, but their own space where this kind of cleansing can take place, and the body is wrapped in a very simple shroud. And put in a casket that is made entirely of wood and natural products. No metal nails can be in the casket, again, to allow from dust to dust. In Israel, they bury directly into the ground without a casket. But here in the United States, we bury in a casket, but again, one that will become a part of the earth most naturally.
It's interesting, some communities in the U.S. do not permit you to bury without a casket.
Right.
Oh, that's right.
So what they've negotiated is, all right, we'll put a casket with a bottomless casket. So even the casket around there, where there's no bottom goes right to dirt.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And some cemeteries require not only a casket, but that you have it hermetically sealed, which then is one more layer beyond being able to go from dust to dust. And so there are, even in those communities, if the law of the land is the law and you have to do that, then what you do is you put a layer of dirt on top of
We do the same thing.
the casket before they then seal it.
When somebody passes away, we say the soul leaves the body. And soul goes to, we can talk about the way it goes through what is described.
Right.
And the body is just a body now. But the body belongs to that soul eventually on the day of judgment. So what we do is exactly what we do. We give a wash, complete wash. And we're so sensitive, not to be hot, not to be cold, just like the body can feel it. We believe the body can feel it. And then we're very gentle. And we protect the privacy of that person. We cover the sheet, then we wash it. Then we wrap it in a white shroud. And we put holy water, which comes from Mecca. And we put the thing, then we cover the body, put it in a casket. And casket, we take it out, we bury it in the dirt to dirt kind of thing. So we don't bury in caskets. We take it out, casket just to carry.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Just to carry. Okay. And then when we get to the grave, we take the body out of the casket and gently drop the body. And we twist facing towards Mecca. So the body is always facing Mecca. And then what we do is, so that it's not buried in sand, we put a little triangular wooden shell above it. So there's a cavity created. And we put a sheetrock on it or a plywood on it, and then you cover the sand. So when you're done, there is a triangular cavity like this, and the body is resting
So there's a space.
So there's a space.
Kind of like you would have in a coffin, except they're not enclosed
Exactly,
in a
it's
coffin.
not enclosed.
All right.
So that.
What happens is immediately after the burial, the focus then turns to the mourners, and the community is then responsible for going back to the home of the mourners and providing a meal of consolation. And
Sitting in Shiva?
Right, at the Shiva home. And the meal of consolation traditionally has eggs in it. That's our sign of life. And so the meal of consolation, and then the community comes and sits. Shiva means 7, and sits with the family for 7 days at their home.
One of the challenges that maybe we all have, but our society doesn't want to deal with death and pushes it aside, so that even some of the rituals we're talking about, our own people don't want to really walk through all those rituals. They just want to go to the funeral home, you take care of it, and
they want to cleanse.
Yes, they want it over without going through. I mean, I think what our rituals help to do, particularly when you talk about Shiva and the 7 days, I mean, you've got to sit with it for 7 days. I mean, the same with if you go through the wake and the burial process and all the different steps, it helps you to express the grief. But I think in our society today, that whether it's because we're so youth-oriented or we're not wanting to confront and deal with death.
Well, we want to be anti-reality.
Yeah.
It's just been fascinating listening to the different burial practices. The deep wisdom is that ancient folk knew something. These traditions didn't just come out of thin air.
Right.
They came out of lived experience and an experience of death and of God. And folk crafted over time these traditions that allow people to grieve and then re-enter life, and allow people to just stay in the presence of mystery without having to have all the answers. That each one of these traditions makes claims, affirmations, says stuff symbolically in ritual that we don't have words for, because sometimes you just have to sit and be in the presence of the mystery without trying to figure it all out. And then help folk, like the old folk used to say, weep and moan. And as they weep and moan and they stay with the community, in time they can re-enter life and in a healthy way. But when they skip over that entrance into mystery and skip over that weeping and a moaning and jump back into life, life goes on, it doesn't, it limps.
Right.
Right, and that's where we see so many struggles in our society today, is that people are bypassing the ritual and the reality. And then a year later, or 6 months, or 5 years, or 10 years.
They've never grieved.
They've never grieved, and it's there for them, but they don't even have words. They don't know that it was connected to their grief.
Because is there a particular reason why you're, say, Baptist?
I'm a Baptist, probably mostly because I grew up in a Baptist home, and so that's what I have known. I have studied on a limited basis other faiths, and so I'm comfortable with the choice that my parents made and that I reaffirmed.
And how is being a Baptist different than another Christian?
Well, there are many things that we hold in common, and I would consider those to be the large affirmations of faith and so forth. Some of the differences would be that the Baptist Church is in what we call a free church tradition, which is to say that our church operates under its own guidelines. We don't have any kind of hierarchy that would say this is what you are to do, this is how you are to organize your church. And so,
are you Southern Baptist?
We are Baptists in the South. We are not. We have had an affiliation with Southern Baptists, but our affiliation is largely removed from that now.
How is that different? Because I really don't know that.
Well, because we would tend to be a more moderate voice within Baptist tradition. We would affirm women in ministry. We ordain women to the diaconate and so forth. So in that regard, we're not as rigid. There are scriptures within our New Testament which seem to indicate, from my vantage point now, they seem to indicate that women are to play a certain role, and they are not to assume certain roles within the life of the church. But people within the tradition that I'm most comfortable would say, that many of those stipulations were more cultural from a patriarchal society in an ancient world. And so therefore we would say that the overarching teaching of the Christian church is that there is no male nor female in Jesus Christ, and so that we are all one. And so a woman can assume any role within the church that a man can assume. That's a big thing for us. That happens within a free church.
I've heard it said that a true visionary is a person who sees earlier and sees farther and sees more than the ordinary person. That was certainly true for Moses. And the beauty of the story that we are told when we're told the story of Moses is that we're told in vivid detail just how much he saw. We're told about this covenant relationship that he imagined, this covenant of relationship, the vision of it that he had in his heart of hearts, a vision that the people of Israel would live a truly distinctive life. It was a comprehensive covenant in which they would strive to bring holiness into every aspect of life. Go back and read the Torah. Go back and read the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers. You'll find that they wanted to be holy in everything, in their diet and in their dress, in their speech and in their action, in their treatment of the poor and the widow and the stranger, in everything that they would do. They would strive to live in holiness, in the constant and abiding awareness that they were living out their lives under the watchful eye of a holy God.
The Episcopal Church, sort of the child of the Anglican tradition, could be described as a Reformed Catholic tradition. That it has elements about it that are Protestant and elements about it that are Catholic. We have priests, but they get married. So that if somebody walked into an Episcopal church on a Sunday morning, it would look very much like a Roman Catholic Mass or Eucharist in a Lutheran tradition. And then there'd be elements that would be Methodist and Presbyterian and Baptist. And so it's a blending of the two. But I can tell you, just as a side note, the I grew up in the Episcopal Church, but my parents didn't. Actually, both of them grew up Baptist. They did. My mother became an Episcopalian in college at some point, and my father was actually in seminary at Wilberforce at the Bishop Payne, which was an AME school in Ohio. And they were dating. She was actually teaching, but they were dating, and she took him to an Episcopal church there in Xenia, Ohio. And this is the late 40s, I think. And so Southern Ohio, while it wasn't pure South, it still was South. And while there weren't Jim Crow signs, it was pretty clear.
I know that area.
And you know the area, yeah, it was pretty clear. And so they went to church, and there weren't that many blacks in the congregation there. And she went up for communion. And the Episcopal Church, you know, in a lot of traditions, people would take communion, kneel at the rail, and the priest would come along and, you know, with the bread first, and then he'd come along with the chalice, and everybody drank from the same chalice. Now, my daddy was a rock rib, dyed-to-wool Baptist, and you didn't drink out of the same chalice. Everybody had an individual one, and when he realized that his fiance, I think they were engaged at that point, was up on that altar rail, and she was the only black person there, everybody else was white, and they were drinking out of the same chalice, he said he just sat there because he wanted to see who was going to drink after she drank. And the priest came along.
This is in the 1940s.
This is in the 40s, yeah. So the priest is kind of going along with the chalice, and finally gets to mommy, and she, you know, makes sign across and drinks. Goes to the next person. Next person did the exact same thing and kept on going. And his comment was, any church where black and white people will drink from the same cup is a church that knows something about Jesus that I want to be a part of.
Yeah.
And I think that's, now, the Episcopal Church hasn't always done that, but at its best. And that's what drew him in. And then he fell in love with liturgy and a lot of that. I think if I could, I wish I could say that the Episcopal Church was like that everywhere, but I do think that there is an openness, a willingness to seek to be inclusive, at least a desire to be that way.
How do you feel, for instance, within your own congregations about people, say, interfaith marriages, for instance, and taking in other people into your congregation that aren't of that faith?
The Islam allows that we could marry, the men could marry the women of the book. So it's okay for my son to marry a Christian woman without changing religion, or a Jewish girl without changing religion. But our daughters are not allowed to do that. They cannot marry a Christian man or a Jewish man. And the reason for that is the continuation of the Islam. Because Islam, the religion goes by the father.
So, okay, so where Jewish, it goes through the women.
With women, so it goes by father. So what Islam wants to do is that children should be Muslim, you can marry. And they do not allow to marry any other religion except Judaism or Christianity. That shows the respect for the religion, right? The only reason the daughters cannot marry outside for that reason.
And
I was just
going off of that, what happens if they do?
They are committing major sin, and it's not allowed, permitted. I mean, you can commit sin and it's not allowed. That's a different story, right?
So are you cut off from the community then?
You don't cut off, but if somebody drinks, it's not allowed. You don't cut off community, but you recognize this is a major sin. So now I'm a real example for that. My daughter met a Christian boy and wanted to marry him. This is the story. And so she told him, let's not go any further because you and I cannot get married. So that thing pursued, and one day he proposed and she said, I can't. He said, I'll become a Muslim. So he went away for a year, and I lost my family. He's a nice boy, he did that, you did all this religion thing and this. I say, I can't do it. The religion says don't do it. I'm not saying. So after a year he came back, he said, Mr. Ahmed, I really learned the religion and I really want to marry her. So I said, all right, then, very simple, you declare that there's only one God and that Prophet Muhammad is the thing, and then you're Muslim. That's them.
If he had not become of your faith and your daughter went against your will and she did marry him, what would have happened?
I would not have thrown out the family. I would not throw out, but I will be repenting for her for the rest of my life.
Would you accept the children?
Of course.
Now, you said that it would be, say, for instance, with your daughter or that sort of thing, that it would be a major sin. Now, when you talk about a major sin
is that you are living in sin for the rest of your life. You're not married.
And then what happens?
Big consequences in the hereafter. Huge consequences in the hereafter.
When you say huge consequences, you talk about
go to hellfire.
Really?
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's no question about that. They
Absolutely.
would just burn in hell.
Right. That's what the religion is. I'm not passing judgment on it, but that's what the Quran says.
In terms of officiating at a wedding between a Jew and a non-Jew, each rabbi within the Reform movement makes their own autonomous decision. And I can tell you where I am. I approach it from what is my authority as a rabbi. My authority is to officiate in creating a Jewish home. That Judaism is going to be the religion of the home and the religion taught to the children and the identity of the home. And so I will say to a couple, an interfaith couple, if you want to have a Jewish home, if there's not another religion being practiced in the home and you've decided, I don't define for you what Judaism is for you, if you've decided that Judaism is the religion of your home and that will be the religion of your children, and if a Jewish ceremony has integrity for you as a couple. I don't feel like I have an authority to do a secular ceremony as a rabbi or to do a Christian ceremony or a Christian-Jewish ceremony as a rabbi. So I don't want to ask a couple on what I consider one of the most important days of their lives to say words that don't have meaning to them. We know that the Torah says 36 times that you shall take care of the stranger because you were a stranger in the land of Egypt. And who does it define as the stranger? Those who are new to your land, the orphan, and the widow. When we look upon people according to their position in society and hold them in esteem according to their wealth or their possessions, and we do not take the Levite and put them in the same category. It's the orphan, the widow, the one unable to fend for themselves. But the teaching about the tithe reminds us that we're all human beings, that we're all equal before God. This coming Sukkot, we will build a sukkah here on our property, on our grounds, and another sukkah downtown in Moore Square, where the homeless live. We will do so because this is our harvest holiday. This is the time when we bring forward our fruits. And we will bring them here to our community, and we will bring them to the homeless in Moore Square.
There'll be no political talk in our mosque, period. God doesn't forbid it. But we don't want to get involved in any politics. This kind of disturbs us from our religious worship concept and purity, spirituality kind of thing. There'll be no sermon on whether gays can serve or not serve. None of those political issues you can bring up. Well, gays and that have religious connotation, that could be, but certainly not political thing, and we just don't. And that's keep our mosque very in harmony. But those are mosque-driven rules, they're not God-given rules.
But you brought up also the issue of gays and lesbians, is to the stance that the Muslim community feels about inclusion in that religion for gays and lesbians.
Again, I want to emphasize that to a Muslim, it's not an individual decision. I've been in corporate environment where I had friends who were gays and lesbian, declared gays and lesbian. That's different. We always go back what God says, what the Quran says. And God says, I've created men and women to raise families. because that's the society. So men and women have been created for a very specific reason, and that is to raise society, to raise children. And because gays and lesbians do not follow that goal of God has forbidden that gays and lesbian is acceptable to Islam. That's God's command. Nothing personal against anybody else, but we follow exactly what God says. We don't deviate from that.
So when you say that forbidden, are you talking about in the religion?
Relationship is forbidden, is what you call haram, is a major sin.
So if someone discovers their orientation to be homosexual, how are they to live their life as a Muslim?
They can be as a Muslim without having any other relationship. Their relationship, by the way, their relationship, if that relationship between men and women out of marriage is also a major sin. And there is no marriage between male to male and female to female, right? So a man and women who are not married have a relationship is a major sin. God says don't do it. But they know they're committing sins.
So they're still welcome.
They're still welcome to.
Welcome is a different story. They are allowed to be. I don't think anybody welcome a sinner. You know is a murderer.
Right.
Right? He has murdered or he has raped women, and you come to mosque. You're not saying, I'm going to welcome you. You say, we allowed you to come and worship.
But, a murderer and a gay or lesbian, that's not the same sin, is it?
It's the same sin, major sin.
It is.
Major sin. Both are major sin.
I think in Christianity, Jesus does welcome the sinner and does all the more invite.
Okay. When I say welcome, I say yes, because let me tell you, the concept of a mosque and a church, I always say that, is a hospital of the spiritually sick. Would you say that? Because we are here to reform who are spiritually misguided. That's what we do in preaching, right? To be guided right to the God's command.
I think, Shakil, you were talking about that the Quran says, and it's very clear, and here's the rule. And from a Reform position, we look at the text, and a text we read just last week in the book of Numbers talks about the daughters of Zelophehad, little known story. 5 daughters of Zelophehad. Zelophehad had no sons. And the laws of inheritance were being given out. When they were given out, it said that the inheritance will go to the son, and if there are no sons, then it goes to the father's brothers, and if the father doesn't have brothers, then it's to the nephews, and on down the line. And the daughters of Zelophehad came forward and said, "No, what about us? Mm-hmm. You know, our father's name is going to be gone. Literally his portion is going to be gone because he didn't have a son." And so Moses takes their claim back to God, and God says they're right. The daughters of Zelophehad are right. So if there are no sons, the inheritance goes to a daughter. And then it goes on and explains the rest of inheritance. The way that I view this is that not only was this an innovation that we find right in the text itself, but it's permission to question and to understand and to look and say, what's the meaning here? Not just what is the law, but what's the purpose of the law? And if the law has become anachronistic in our time and in our understanding of culture, then we have a right to make adjustments to the law to allow for a greater participation or to allow for making sense in a way that's going to reach people in our day. And so that kind of is the segue into the question of how Reform Judaism treats gay and lesbian couples.
I like what you said, that you made a decision on being a Reform based on a certain evidence in Torah. This is a story you just said. As long as there is a basis for it, Islam will permit that. But you can't say, yeah, Quran doesn't say that, and tradition don't say that, but it's modern time, let's change. That's not allowed. So definitely people who, the different practices in Islam, as you do that, they find a tradition or a verse in Quran which they interpret, look, this points out, just like you did, that you could do that. And so people say that's acceptable. Some people won't, that's okay. But really there was a basis for it. Where the Islam objection comes in, there was no basis for it, is the modern thinking, let's just do that, and Quran doesn't say that, or tradition doesn't say that.
Right, but I think that what we find today in our world today is that people are taking stories or verses from our texts, and we can make them say, we know this as much as anyone, we can make them say almost anything we want. And so there has to be a care between eisegesis and exegesis.
Consensus will not be there. So we have one of the rules in Islam, that if you're going to reform something which is called ijtihad means a reformation. If you want to do ijtihad, then you must have a consensus.
Okay.
Not one group saying that. So Prophet Muhammad said that as long as the consensus, go with the consensus, because you will not be wrong. But if one person said, I want to do that, and the rest will say no, then that's not you should follow. So there's ijtihad basis on consensus.
But how do you ever go from the kernel of an idea
You can ask a lot of that.
to the reform? Because at first, everybody says you're crazy. At first, everybody says you're crazy, so do you have to stop altogether, or can you keep coming back and coming back and coming back?
There'll be basis for it. Like if you say, like we are very clear in Quran that with gays and lesbians, that's not permitted. Now, if you say that it is, what basis did you find in Torah that it is okay?
So the basis that I find in the Torah is that God says that we are all created in the divine image.
Yeah.
That's number one.
Yeah.
The second thing is that the Torah says nothing about lesbianism, nothing at all.
What about Sodom and Gomorrah?
It's not lesbianism, it's about men.
All right.
Right, but not about women.
All right.
So here we have a whole half.
So gaze is clear. Sodom and Gomorrah really say.
Okay, on the one hand. On the other hand, if you look at the Leviticus verse, which is very clear, that says that if a man lies with a man like he lies with a woman, then he's to be put to death. Okay? This is very clear text. So there are two things from a Reformed tradition that is done with that. And it depends. There are lots and lots of voices out there. First of all, if you take that text in its greater context, it's talking about idolatry. And you're talking about a society where idolaters used as part of their ritual homosexuality. Okay? So if you're talking about a monogamous gay relationship where they have faith in one God, are we talking about the same thing that's going on in Leviticus? And so there's one answer of saying, we take this text and you have to understand it in its larger context. And then the second is to say, and what I can say from a Reformed tradition that an Orthodox couldn't say, is that there are some texts that are so anachronistic that were fitting for a time and a place in history, and David alluded to this, and we're just not there anymore.
There's a difference. This is the difference comes in Islamic, because we are so bound by anything you want a basis and a foundation and a consensus and a change. And to the point that traditions say that you can never be a righteous person unless you learn to avoid the marginal things and stay in the middle course. Because when you get to the marginal things, then the boundaries keep on increasing.
But then I couldn't be a rabbi. From that basis, then a woman never would have been accepted as a rabbi, because there had to be the first woman who was the margin.
That's the difference.
Yeah, it is a difference.
There's a difference.
But even within Christianity, the same tension is there. I mean, I would clearly take the position that gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgendered people are children of God and do the equal treatment of the church and ought to have equal access to all of its ministries. Now, there are Episcopalians who would say the exact opposite, and they would argue, based on the text of Scripture, that ought not to be the case. I can construct an argument based on the text of Scripture that ought to be, but my argument might be a minority position initially, And it might move toward that consensus eventually, which I think in the Episcopal Church is sort of happening. That's not happening in the Anglican Communion, but worldwide, but certainly in the U.S. Episcopal Church, that's the case. And I think that's part of our tradition, where sometimes you have to recognize the prophet as the prophet, like Ezekiel. Whether they hear or refuse to hear, at least they'll know a prophet's been in the middle of them. Sometimes the prophet just has to keep saying it, and if it is of God, it will last, and a consensus will form around it, and then the religious tradition will reform itself around that. If it's not of God, it won't last. If you cannot preach like Peter, and you cannot pray like Paul, you can tell the love of Jesus, how he died to save us all. Desmond Tutu, interpreting this passage, says this, and I quote, he says, God sent us here to help God realize God's dream of a new kind of world. Gentle, caring, compassionate, sharing. So help me. Please help me to draw all. For there are no outsiders or aliens. All are insiders. All belong. All, black and white, rich and poor, young and old, male and female, educated, uneducated, gay, lesbian, straight, all belong to the family of God. I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself.
Homosexuality, I think you need to also talk about marriage, that the teaching of human sexuality is the same, regardless of one's orientation. That it's the expression of sexuality would be in the context of marriage, and that would be where that is best expressed. So whether one is heterosexual or homosexual outside the context of that marriage that we look at as a sacrament would be considered sinful.
So would it be also a major sin for somebody to be, say, a gay couple?
Well, we look at major, minor, mortal, venial sin, and mortal sin would really be going against the will of God. It would be much more of a conscious going against God, and the intention is to go against God. So I'm not sure that it would be a mortal sin if someone is in a committed relationship expressing their love for one another. They may form their conscience in such a way that is how they're choosing to live out their life. That one of the teachings of the Church is that the formation of the individual conscience is the primacy of conscience. So one might form their conscience in such a way, and this really, again, I think homosexuality, heterosexuality, we got to keep them together because it's the same thing by way of birth control. That in the Catholic Church, the use of artificial means for contraception would be considered outside of church teaching.
Science versus religion. The scientific evidence, things about the beginning of time versus the biblical beginning of time.
One of the mistakes we make is taking our ancient sacred texts and looking at them as not only sacred texts, but looking at them as a history book and as scientific data and evidence and as evidence of how society was built and run. They never were written for those purposes. There are historical pieces within our sacred texts, but they're not about history. And there is acknowledgement of the way the world works, that the sun rises and the sun sets every day, but it's not about astronomy. And when we try and transform our sacred text into another text that is not, we're misusing it.
Do we close our eyes to one so that we can have the other?
Medical science can actually save a life when that life is threatened. Religious faith tells you why that life matters at all. Those are two different, though related, but they're two different questions and issues. One is, why does that life matter, and how can that life be lived to the fullest? Another is, how do we save that life and get that person breathing again?
And talking about the scientist, the medical doctor, and the religion, but also about the belief in miracles and praying when
people are very, very ill.
When I get sick, I want the whole team working together. I want physicians doing their thing, and I want prayer people praying. I want the whole team. Let God have every access for grace to work through human modalities and other modalities. Why restrict God?
So the thing is, use of science in every aspect is absolutely part of religion. Means how can a little aspirin, little thing, can fix all the thing? That's God's gift. But God told you how to make that aspirin. God showed you how to do that. So God is making evil. So therefore, clearly, religion and science are together, 100% together.
One of the prayers in the Catholic ritual when someone is ill is, through the healing gifts and talents of doctors and nurses, may your healing gifts, O Lord, be granted to this person.
Right.
It's really through the gifts and talents and skills of the doctors and nurses and surgeons. Emma's dad has been diagnosed with prostate cancer. He's already battled kidney cancer twice, so all the more it has caused him to face his mortality and be far more aware of what's really important in life. So he began a project, writing notes on 826 napkins, so that Emma, who will be entering high school next year, will have a note every school day until she graduates from high school. And also as a way to leave Emma with enough fatherly advice to last a lifetime. This is, for him, really about leaving a legacy so that she can understand some of my life's philosophies, and most importantly, how much I love her. Most importantly, how much I love her. In the first reading from the prophet Isaiah, God assures us that even if a mother, even if a parent might forget her infant, be without tenderness for the child of her womb, God assures us, I will never forget you.
In one of the Judaism classes that I took, we were talking about cremation. I knew that it was that the Jews were not supposed to be cremated, but I never knew why.
There's a stream within Judaism who believes that in the Messianic age, when that day comes, that everyone will rise up, literally from the grave, and therefore cremation would not allow you to rise up as a whole body and to return. It's not my theology. It's not my philosophy. It is why, though, there are many Jews who die from around the world who want to be buried in Jerusalem, right outside of the gates of the old city, because they believe that during the Messianic age, that the people who will rise up are the ones closest first, that they'll rise up right from there. And so there are Jews who die here who are buried actually in Israel, or if they can get a grave close enough, in Jerusalem.
Do the Muslims have a different take on the end?
Muslims have a very clear, defined the way the world will come to an end. It's defined very, in quite some detail. Muslims believe that Jesus, peace be upon him, when he was put on the cross, at that time God had another purpose for him to come in the end, so he lifted him. And he substituted somebody else. And Jesus is living with God. And at that time, when Antichrist is bringing all this chaos, Jesus will come back. And he will kill the Antichrist, and then Gog and Magog will come and they'll kill him. And then there'll be complete harmony in the world as a God's kingdom, total. And all religion will be together under him, and he will lead the whole nation. And after that, the world come to end. And the world come to end with an angel blowing a trumpet, and everything in the world, the physical chaos, the mountains will fly, and everything will, like earthquakes, anything coming, and the sun will come to within few yards of people, and they will melt, and the sun will rise from them, and everybody will be dead. And then we end the trumpet blown, and everybody rise from the graves. And so the whole process is very clearly defined, but it's very clear in our faith that Jesus is coming back. He will rule rule the world in total harmony. He will get married and he will die a natural death. And then the world comes to an end. That's our faith. It's new. Lucy?
It is new. I hadn't heard the whole progression.
The idea that Christ will return is the notion that that God is going to ultimately have God's way, and that the kingdom of God, the values of that kingdom are going to be revealed, and so forth. So that the purpose of God, the eternal purpose of God, will not be thwarted. It oftentimes appears that it is in our day and age, but the day is coming when the kingdom of God will be revealed. I really look at that as the Bible's way of defining that that we're moving toward an end.
But I'd like to kind of turn to issues of today and about your thoughts about government and religion and church and state. And it seems that we were founded as America on the separation of church and state, and yet it seems in the last decade or so that some people want them together, and some people want it still quite split. So I'd like to have your thoughts about where you think we are regarding that, and where you'd like to see us go.
Our faith calls us to be involved in the political life and political process of our nation. Every 4 years, the Catholic bishops of the United States issue a document called Faithful Citizenship, in which they encourage us to, as Catholics, to come to know what the issues are and to make good decisions in the election booth based on some core principles, what I would describe as our Catholic social teaching, which really at its root is the sacredness of the human person, the dignity of the person, and the common good would be the two pillars of Catholic social teaching.
The separation of church and state is, and the right of every American to worship in the fashion that they see fit, is fundamental to our democracy. And so it has been a matter of personal emancipation for many, many Jews through the generations, and coming from other parts of the world where this is just not the case. So this is, within the Jewish community, sacrosanct, because we know that if it's to fall, then our ability to live among the majority is seriously threatened. And so there's a matter of life-saving, of being for that. And in terms of involvement in political issues, I would say that Mark's description is not far from, although the congregation and the movement would never put out a list of politicians to vote for.
It's absolutely essential that church and state be separated, since no one can answer the question, if they're not, whose church? Yeah. And so that's absolutely essential. I think that's part of the genius of this democratic republic. But it's also equally essential for peoples of faith to be involved in the public arena and to speak with humility, but to speak and to be represented in that. When the churches have been silent, when the synagogues and mosques have been silent, very often horrible things have resulted. And sometimes horrible things have resulted when we've opened our mouths too. But more often than not, if we live faithfully into the values of our traditions, that witness in society will actually have positive impact for the most part, not completely. Too many churches, and I pick on churches now, too many churches were quiet while Jim Crow raged. Too many churches were quiet while slavery ruled the land. Too many churches were quiet while women were less than equal citizens. Too many churches were quiet while children were working in industrial plants and things in the 19th century. So when the religious community is silent about its very values, then it allows chaos to reign elsewhere. and it abdicates its moral voice. So church and state, keep it separate. That's a no-brainer. But for the religious community to abdicate its responsibility to live out its values with humility, recognizing that this is my interpretation of my faith's values, I could be wrong. If we're quiet, what good are we?
The other side of that is that the religious community can be, as you mentioned, at its worst.
Yes.
And that's why the separation needs to be, it needs to be constantly renewed, the separation of church and state, because the danger goes both ways. The state, if it takes its power to the extreme, it can try to govern who we are, what we believe, how we worship, and so forth, and we reject that. But at the same time, we would not want for a particular expression of faith to become the majority and then begin to legislate how other people would have to interpret their faith and so forth. So the separation of church and state is something that we need to continually protect, because it is a part of the American genius, and also it really is hand in hand with religious liberty, and that's something that we believe in. Every person has a right to believe or not to believe, and we should not try to coerce anyone into any position when it comes to matters of faith. That is between a person and God.
Thank you. Shakil, your thoughts?
Well, because we have separation of church and state, it's protected.
Yeah.
That's right.
Two ways to look at it. First, very clearly that in Islam, there is no separation between church and state. They are the same.
You're talking the religion versus the
whole governance, whole matter is the same. There's no separation church and religion. Church and religion and government.
So law is law.
Law is law. Now, why does it say that? If you believe that God has given us all the faculties to think, to work hard, to be nice to people, to do the right things to people, and God has given us those faculties so that God can also give us the rules which are just in every fashion. So, talk about freedom of religion. Quran says very specifically, La ikraha fid din, there is no compulsion in religion. Anybody who wants to practice can practice the way he wants to practice. The law defines equality. The law defines justice, independent of what faith you come from. So there is a Sharia phobia. You all know that. Everybody is talking, oh my God, these Muslims take over, the Sharia will take over. Now, if you don't have a Sharia law, and then you let it be together, then you're subject to what is a man-made legislation, and now you force on the people what I think, then the separation has to be.
And that's where the divine wisdom comes in. That's where Allah's wisdom comes in. Allah says, I'm all wise. He's all knowing. He knows the future. He knows the past. He knows what is good for us. So He's given us in the Quran and the tradition a law, a divine law, and we call it Sharia. How can anything be better than the Sharia law? Cannot be. And that's what Allah has given us. And so the essence of Sharia is characterized by mercy and compassion. So Allah is all merciful, all compassionate. And the very purpose of Sharia is to bring peace and harmony in this world.
I think your premise of what's the meaning of life, or how do we figure this all out, I don't know that there really is a way to do that other than to live out the mystery, in that religion is supposed to help us expand the human heart so that we can live peaceably with one another. And I think religion really works well when it does that, and when it doesn't, well, then we suffer the consequences of the discord.
So do you mean
society.
rather than maybe trying to seek answers, just try to live the best life that we can type of thing, and the answers will show themselves?
One of the things that the faith tradition can help people with is how to deal with the manifold ambiguities of life. Things do not always turn out the way we think they will. We teach our young people that you work hard, you do your job, and good things will come to you. And most of the time that's true, but sometimes it's not true. And what do you do when you feel rejected by God? You've prayed and didn't get the answer that you were looking for. How do you deal with that? And learning to live with those ambiguities. And hopefully learning how to deal with the disappointments and the difficult experiences of life with grace and with kindness and with a sense that I'm going to handle this and I'm going to make it.
God said that when a child is born, his fate is written. What's going to happen to him until he dies. And God says, I have given you a choice. These two things don't reconcile. The only way reconcile, in my mind, that God's vision is timeless. His dimension is, he knows the time dimension. So that's the only way these two things reconcile. God has seen this movie before. God has seen what he will do because he's timeless. Which we are seeing in 100 years, his dimension is timeless.
What religion invites us to do is to embrace that mystery, both of life and of death, to embrace the mysterious, to sit with it, and then to evolve with one another as stronger people into what we can do in this world.
Would the world be better without all these religions?
So what's
I posed the question. I
We're waiting for you to answer.
Oh, yeah.
What would you say to them?
At their best, they matter ultimately because they point us in the direction of God's dream for all of us. At their worst, they should be abolished. Most of the time, they're somewhere in between.
Do I have more questions? You bet I do.
As I raise my head with these questions in me, where does my help come from? When will I finally feel free? I lift my eyes to you on high, my soul standing small, who will hear my cry? I lift my eyes to you on high, my soul standing small, who will hear my cry? This is where my help comes from. This is where my help comes from. The days come and gone, and my baby, she sleeps. No place left to turn but to you, with every aching my soul keeps. I lift my eyes to you on high, my soul standing small, who will hear my cry?